Well, welcome to the 1980s. You're going to see a presentation that's going to include Ronald Reagan, and as you can see, the Cold War that starts in 1945 and will last until 1991. Ronald Reagan is the president that is president during most of all the 1980s, from 1980 to 1988, and so it's kind of known as the Reagan decade. Reagan originally is going to be an actor, which is actually going to play into his favor because he becomes known as a great communicator. He is able to deliver a line really well, and in doing so, he is going to be at ease when he is put on television in front of people, not only for things that he's going to struggle with, some of the problems that he has in his administration, but especially some of those trying times, like when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded in 1986, and probably given some of the most famous lines that he has. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, he's going to become known for because of his actor's background. Reagan also was an FDR Democrat. He liked what FDR did during the 1930s, but by the time we get to the 1980s, he believes that the Great Society has really exploded the domestic spending of the United States, and that more spending should be given to the military, and we should build up our military. And so he's going to do this in a way that is going to create what is known as deficit spending. He also was elected to the board of directors in the Screen Actors Guild in 1941, and does testify before the HUAC committee that Richard Nixon was a part of. He will first become interested in the conservative movement when he hears Barry Goldwater's speech delivered in 1964, and he realizes, being the former governor of California, he was raised as a Democrat, but he kind of realizes that the Democratic Party with Lyndon Johnson has kind of left him, and so I think one of his statements is that he didn't leave the Democratic Party; the Democratic Party left him. They actually became too liberal for him, LBJ liberal, and so he will see Barry Goldwater in 1964 as kind of a new direction in his career path. In 1976, he actually tries to run to become president. He will be defeated narrowly by Gerald Ford, but as he's delivering a speech to the Republican National Convention, it's then that the Republicans realize they've made a mistake and they should have nominated Ronald Reagan for the presidency. But I think it's actually it paid off, because I don't think the nation was ready for a Republican to be elected again in 1976, and so they elect Jimmy Carter as president in 1976. But then by 1980, because of multiple events that happened during the Carter administration, Reagan is going to run against Carter with a slogan that government is not the solution to your problem, government is the problem. And in doing so, he's going to pretty much nail it for the American people. They're going to look at this and say, hey, this is a problem, that the government is not really solving a lot of the problems that we have here in the United States. And so his debate tactics in the 1980 election, as you can see, is going to be, he's going to point out Jimmy Carter's problems that he had, along with stagflation. He is going to portray Carter as weak on foreign policy, and that he's going to build back up the military, which he does. His philosophy for the military is peace through strength. He says as long as we have a strong army, people will not mess with the United States as much, and that there'll be more peace globally than there will be chaos globally. And there would be a contrasting viewpoint with that when you take a look at President Obama, that wanted to lead from behind in his policy in the mid 2000s. You're going to see, or in the teens in the 2000s, you're going to see a policy where he's going to decide that we should not fund the military as much and let other countries lead. And in doing so, sometimes there is consequences with that. The question that Reagan, of course, will ask the American people in 1980, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And that question is devastating to Carter. Carter, not only on an economic policy, domestic policy, is facing stagflation, but on an international policy, he had one major achievement, which was the Camp David Accords, but he's also going to see the Russians invade Afghanistan, the Soviet Union gain in strength globally, and then finally you're going to start to see the growth of Shia Islam over in Iran with the Iranian Revolution and bringing about the Ayatollah Khomeini and the taking of our hostages for over 444 days. When all these events take place in just 4 short years, the American people are ready for something else. And in doing so, they will elect Reagan president with a landslide victory in 1980 over the incumbent. As you can see from this electoral map, Jimmy Carter had Walter Mondale as his vice president, and so Georgia and Minnesota actually vote for the Democrats along with a few other states. But this is a pretty big landslide victory, which will be followed by an even larger landslide victory in 1984. As soon as Reagan becomes president, only 69 days into his presidency, John Hinckley Jr. will try to assassinate Ronald Reagan, and this is what a lot of historians say breaks Tecumseh's curse, where all the presidents that are elected on these 0 or odd years will die. Hinckley does this to impress Jodie Foster. He thought, hey, I'm going to get a date by possibly assassinating the President of the United States, but Reagan's going to survive. He almost dies on the operating table, but when he survives and literally he gets out of the car, walks into the hospital after being shot with a bullet just centimeters away from his heart, and then literally collapses when he gets into the hospital. Again, the actor in him. He knew that he had to perform. He knew he had to show strength to the American people, and he does. And when he recovers, he's seen as an even greater hero. Reagan, of course, is going to be known for his economic policy, and it's really easy to remember his economic policy name, which is Reaganomics. Reaganomics is what's better known as also supply-side economics. You can see it also called trickle-down economics. The voodoo economics actually comes from his vice president. You want to talk about a unique pairing is Ronald Reagan's going to have George Herbert Walker Bush. He's going to nominate as his vice president. But when Reagan's running against Herbert Walker Bush in 1980 for the Republican nomination, George Herbert Walker Bush calls Reagan's tax policy voodoo economics. But then he will start to say, hey, this is not a bad idea, because he wants to get nominated as vice president, and so he will adopt the Reaganomics as his policy during this time period. Reagan will, he felt his first thing that he should do is cut the top marginal tax rate from 70% to 25%. That means that the top income earners back in the day, which was about $250,000. So if you earned over $250,000, your tax rate was about 70% of your income. So you only were able to keep 30% of your income. Well, today they lowered it down to 25%, and it's raised back up to about 40% for the top tax bracket. But you got to remember that is a progressive tax, so you build up to that. But if your first paycheck of the year happens to be like $333,000 and above, today you're going to pay 40% for the rest of the year of your income. So it depends on how you acquire your income, and how much money you make every single year is going to determine your tax rate. But Reagan felt that 70% was way too large. Some of the other Cold Warriors with Reagan during this time period, as you can see here, you're going to have Pope John Paul II, Margaret Thatcher from Great Britain, and Mikhail Gorbachev, the premier that will replace a few, between Brezhnev and Gorbachev, there's a few Russian leaders that die rather quickly, and then finally they elect a younger Mikhail Gorbachev as the premier, and Gorbachev, along with Reagan, Thatcher, and John Paul II, will end up bringing an end to this Cold War. Pope John Paul II, as a Cold Warrior, he is a Polish pope. He knows the horrors of the Soviet Union and their occupation of Poland. And in doing so, he's going to help to lead, along with Lech Walesa, a solidarity movement that he's going to bring about Polish unionism and try to end the Soviet domination of the Polish Empire, because Poland had been a satellite nation of the Soviet Union since the 50s. And so they're going to end that in the 1980s with these two great leaders. You then see Margaret Thatcher, and the Cold War. Margaret Thatcher is first and only woman to be elected until Theresa May. Theresa May now is the second woman to be British Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister. Both of these women are conservative. Margaret Thatcher will be a huge asset for Reagan. She's kind of seen as the Iron Lady. The British will see a victory in the Falkland Islands in 1982, helps jolt her into national prominence as leading that British independence down in the Falkland Islands. And then finally, when she meets with the Soviets, meets with Mikhail Gorbachev is going to nickname her the Iron Lady. In other words, she pretty much takes care of business. Mikhail Gorbachev, on the other hand, he's going to be a Soviet leader that came to power in '84. Reagan's first term is really going to be dictated on the premise that the Soviet Union is the evil empire. And when he says that, it scares a lot of people, but he is going to say, yes, they are the evil empire, and then he's going to start to make deals with Mikhail Gorbachev, because Gorbachev wants to initiate what is known as perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika means that they're going to have reorganization, and glasnost means openness, that we're going to reorganize the Soviet Union, we're going to have more open society. It is a propaganda ploy by Mikhail Gorbachev. He didn't want to see the unraveling of the Soviet Union, but really events are going to come so fast to the Soviet Union that Gorbachev is going to be unable to stop the freight train in front of him, and by 1991 the Soviet Union is going to dissolve with the Union Treaty in 1991, ending the Soviet domination of Eastern and Western Europe. The Cold War under Reagan, as I said before, he calls them the evil empire in his first term. Reagan's goal actually was a world without nuclear weapons, which, if you think about it, when we've had no nuclear weapons, we've had millions die. And with nuclear weapons, we have thousands die. So there could be an argument that nuclear weapons have prevented millions from dying, eventually stopping a conventional war. But there is also that threat of a nuclear war, which could cause tens of millions and possibly hundreds of millions to die. Reagan also will be responsible for creating what becomes known as the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. This is better nicknamed Star Wars, after the action film that was created in the 70s and early 80s. And the Star Wars is meant to, as a missile intercepting system. Originally, they were thinking that it was going to be lasers, but now we have the ability to actually send missiles and intercept other missiles. And so we first see that in the Persian Gulf War with the Patriot system that is introduced. And then later on we have Iron Dome that's over Israel. It used to be in Poland, and it was removed in 2009 from Poland, but we might reinstitute that in Poland to protect the Polish people. Reagan and Gorbachev in 1987 will end up signing some treaties, which is called the INF treaties, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which will start to reduce the number of missiles that all the countries have. And probably the most famous speech that Reagan's going to give is going to be in 1987, where he's over in Germany, and he is going to ask Gorbachev to tear down this wall. And he's referencing the Berlin Wall that 2 years later, a little over 2 years later, will end up coming down. Originally, it was created in 1961 to keep people in, but now it's going to be torn down in 1989, and Germany will end up reuniting. One scandal to continue the problems that a lot of presidents have in their second term. One scandal that you should know is what's known as the Iran-Contra scandal. During this time period, we were actually supporting the country of Iraq in fighting Iran, but then we realized that we would like to fund a group of Contras that are down in Nicaragua that the Democrats did not want to fund. So we then, as it says there, we support Iraq through most of the war, but Reagan wanted to financially support these Contras. And so what we're going to do is we're actually going to sell weapons to Iran, take the profits of that, and we're going to fund the Contras. In doing so, Reagan said that he had no knowledge of this program, that Ollie North, as you can see down there in the lower right-hand corner, Ollie North is going to take responsibility for this, trying to fight the Sandinistas. But again, this is another Cold War battle. You're going to see the Sandinistas are backed by the Soviets, and we're trying to back the Contras to have a free Nicaragua. The problem is that in doing so, it was totally illegal, but it was never linked to President Reagan, but he did take responsibility for the action. Oliver North will end up being sentenced to 3 years, but that will be suspended prison term. He serves 2 years probation, $150,000 in fines, and 1,200 hours of community service. Oliver North later on in, I believe it's 1992, I think he tries to run for the United States Senate, but he will run unsuccessfully for the United States Senate in the state of Virginia. Other things that take place under Reagan's administration, you're going to see a more conservative Supreme Court. SCOTUS will have Warren Burger will leave office, and Reagan actually moves William Rehnquist to Chief Justice, and he will nominate Antonin Scalia as an Associate Justice to replace William Rehnquist at his justice level. Now, it's kind of unique that they actually did this, because most presidents will not nominate somebody to be Chief Justice from the court. They a lot of times go outside the court, but William Rehnquist actually gets promoted up the court. I saw a video once that showed Rehnquist, and he says he made the longest journey from Associate Justice to actually Chief Justice than any other guy did. It just took him forever to get there. In the middle there is Antonin Scalia. He actually is the justice that died in 2016, but he was appointed by Reagan in 1992. And one of the other people that's appointed by Reagan in 1992 is going to be Sandra Day O'Connor. When another justice resigns, he will actually appoint the first female justice to the United States Supreme Court, and of course she's from the great state of Arizona. If you're an Arizona kid, you know everything about Sandra Day O'Connor, because there's so many different places that are named after her. There is a unique district down in North San Antonio that all of the high schools are actually named after Supreme Court justices. You have O'Connor down there, you have Berger down there, you have Warren down there, you have Taft down there. So it's kind of interesting that a lot of these all those high schools, and I think it's North Side District, is all named after Supreme Court justices. Some of the social issues that will actually take place during this time period, television is going to have a big jump, and really it's cable television that's going to have a big jump. You're going to see new channels such as MTV, created in '79, along with CNN and ESPN, are going to be created. You also then begin to see rap music and rock and roll begin to flourish during this time period. You have the beginning of, as we all know, the gangster rap, but hard rock and roll and stuff like that become part of the music genre of the 1980s. And then you're going to have scandals within the different churches that are going to go through. A lot of the Protestant churches. The first picture there is Tammy and Jim Baker. A lot of these people will end up being found that they had scammed a lot of the different monies. They had the PTL network. Jimmy Swaggart, who actually is still on TV, which is unbelievable, but he had some scandals that took place within his home church. He will then confess, as you can see right there, he confesses that he had sinned in before his people, and so he will resign. But then, of course, he makes a comeback. Oral Roberts is one of the other televangelists that actually becomes really popular, that you can see there. And so these different PTL leaders, or different leaders that are on television, are actually going to bring a movement to the 1980s that we see. And probably one of the guys that actually is going to have a big effect on a lot of the evangelists that he gets to start in the 1950s is Billy Graham. And amazing enough, he is still alive now in 2017. He's in his 90s, but he's kind of seen as the father of these evangelists. And he also helps to give birth, like you see down there in the lower right-hand part, James Dobson, and Focus on the Family. You're going to see this organization is going to try to push for more restrictions on a family choice like abortion and stuff like that, and try to push for more adoption. And so it's just definitely, the 80s is kind of seen as more of a conservative time period in the United States history. If you want to compare the 80s with some other time period, you can also almost compare it with the